Today we're going to be talking about public policy in Texas. What is public policy? Well, the definition of public policy is basically whatever the government chooses to do or not to do. And the difference between public policy and politics, because the two are not the same thing, and people have a tendency to think that they are, but public policy, like I said, is what they choose to do. So the rules and the regulations that they actually make up that constitute basically all of the rules that we all follow. And that's kind of how public policy works, as opposed to politics, which is basically how they get it done, which means you could have compromise, you could have draconian standards, you could have all sorts of different things built into the elements to make it actually happen. But again, it's whatever process you happen to choose or your government uses as a natural process for using that illustrates how public policy gets formed and then how it gets carried out. So there's a couple of different theories of public policy processes. The first one is, it's called incremental change. And by these processes, I mean, this is how it actually happens. And so not every theory is correct and not every theory is wrong, which mean every other theory does not mean every other theory is wrong. And so what I'm saying is the process that people actually use to get these sorts of things done can take all sorts of different ways of actually happening. And so how you look at it is kind of how you see public policy process. So like the first one is called incremental change. And this is the idea that things happen slowly and gradually, and eventually we get to a point where actual change takes place. So the other way is, it's a concept I use quite often. I used to explain this to students, and I like the term, and sometimes I think because the term sounds a little more scientific, it sounds much more complicated than it actually is. It's called punctuated equilibrium, which is a really interesting concept. It comes from biology, at least I believe it comes from biology, and it was borrowed by political science to kind of explain how the process of things actually happens. So like I used it for a theory on anarchy to explain how anarchy can actually be a beneficial structure rather than a bad structure, as most people tend to see it, because anarchy gets filled with all sorts of connotations of throwing Molotov cocktails and stuff like that, but that's not actually what it is. And so punctuated equilibrium indicates that you'll have periods of generally gradual change, like we talked about with incremental change, but then every now and then something happens that causes a government to do huge implementations overnight, and so things get done during that period. So like if you look at the American Revolution, whereas up until we had the revolution and we started throwing tea into the water, we had basically people kind of complying and doing exactly what they were supposed to do. But then during this process, which is war, which is all sorts of chaos going all over the place, things happened. And what often happens that people make the mistake of not understanding with punctuated equilibrium, with not even realizing it exists, is they see what happened before and they saw what happened after. But there's this middle period where there's total anarchy and everything going on, where things actually happen. Changes are made. So like if we're trying to get policies done, so some situation happens like a pandemic or governmental collapse in certain areas, or prison riots or something to that effect, to where it causes people during that process to deal with it, and when they deal with it, they enact certain things as more norms that they didn't have before. And so when we're done at the very end, we hit a level that we weren't at before, because we never would have gotten there if it hadn't been for that middle period, which is the punctuated equilibrium. So it's basically what happens is you have everything's going fine over here, a bunch of action and all sorts of things can go up and down and all that, and then it's stable from that point on there. So that period in between is what's called punctuated equilibrium, if that makes sense. The other theory, another theory, third one, is the multiple streams theory, which is kind of like the way of actually putting together a speech. You know, problem, cause, and solution, except for multiple streams, we tend to go with their problem and then a solution. And then after that, it's the politics that take place to make that solution, the politics that happen after the solution is actually made. And then the fourth theory, or there are many more theories, but these are the main ones that people tend to focus on, is policy feedback theory, which is choices are made by choosing from a limited list of options and circumstances, you know, because you really don't have any other choice. So you take what happens and what's in front of you, you know, and then you choose a viable option or answer based on all of the resources that you have available. So, I mean, to coin an old phrase, you go to war with the army you have, not the one you wish you had, if that makes any sense. Trying not to get political with that, but you get what I mean. So anyway, let's talk about how the policy-making process actually works. So it usually starts with problem identification and agenda setting. So problem identification, you got to figure out what's wrong. And so if you can't figure out what's wrong, or you may realize something's wrong, but you don't realize how to actually solve it or what the specific problem is, because there's variable analysis, which is really important to understand the concept of, is you can look at a whole bunch of different things and go, this is the reason why something happens. Like, I'll give you an example. For poverty in America, okay, you can look at it and say the reason for poverty could be because racism. It could be because economic inequalities between different classes. It could be all sorts of these different reasons, but the thing is, people have a tendency to focus specifically on one of them and forget that there could be all sorts of underlying causes. So yes, it could be racism, could be, or let's go the opposite direction. You could have, you know, the problem of something like economic disparities between different classes. Okay, that could be a problem, but part of the problem may actually be because it's caused by, you know, tints of racism. So those sorts of things kind of play into it. So it doesn't mean one negates the other or says the other one's not important or one's more important than the other, but sometimes you have to understand what the different causes are of something in order to identify what the problem is in the first place. So the problem isn't just people are poor and need better conditions. The problem is this is the underlying problem making it happen, and therefore it will probably cause all sorts of other problems going down the line, like a lower education in the country and stuff like that. So once you've kind of figured out what the problem is, then you have to turn around to agenda setting, which is kind of figure out how are we supposed to actually solve it. And so it's getting together with, you know, usually like factions to say, this is how I think we should tackle this, and then you do it that sort of way. Now remember, those are sometimes quite often mired in politics or mired down in politics. So you have to, you know, take the give and take on that, and that's how politics actually works. Politics, like I said, is not policy. And so policy is how you get things done, whereas politics is sometimes the ways of doing it or the ways to make sure you don't do it. Because politics is not always that beneficial to the long run. It's just a process that exists, and you can't really distance yourself from it without, you know, literally taking care of things without being there or having any actual input other than just, you know, textbook responses, which basically rarely ever works or makes things better. So the next thing you do after problem identification and agenda setting is policy formation. So this is, you decide what you're going to do. And remember, that was the politics that kind of got you to come up with the answers for that. And then you go, this is the way we're going to do it. And this is exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to advocate more money, or we're going to allocate more money for a particular program, or we're going to remove money from a particular program because it's not giving us the benefits we need, and maybe that money might go elsewhere in a better fashion. So then once you come up with the idea of how you're going to actually do it, then we have what's called policy adoption. So this is how you get things done. This is the process of actually getting it done. So, having law enforcement enforce certain laws, having the court systems, respond in certain ways based off of the legitimacy of particular claims here and there. Legislators making more laws and more rules and more stipulations to make sure things actually get done. That's all part of the policy adoption, which may require all sorts of, continuous feedback over and over again to get things done, because maybe the first time you did it, you didn't get the results you actually wanted. And so therefore you keep, finessing it until you actually get what you actually need done. And then policy implementation, you do it. That's literally kind of the last step of the whole thing. And then hopefully, which we tend not to do as much as we should, we do feedback after to figure out, did it really work? One of the other, one of the concepts that's really important to understanding with policy is it's called the Policy Liberalism Index. And we tend to use this nowadays more of a, are you left or right kind of a thing, as opposed to originally it's kind of designed to see how an organization or a location or an entity of government, how far they swing one way or the other on particular issues. And part of the problem with that is people have this tendency to paint one side or the other as completely right or completely wrong, and they make such broad strokes over everything that, like, if you're for one issue, you must therefore be against all these other issues because that side likes all that. Well, that's not always the case. And so even individual states are completely different this way. So Texas is historically more on the more on the conservative side of the house of national politics. And so it usually tends to be somewhere around towards the bottom of the list. Not completely at the bottom, but it gets down there quite a bit. But a couple of other issues kind of generate the ability to bring it up a little bit. And that's why I said it all depends on the liberalism index, and there's all sorts of different ones that measure all sorts of different things. So something like gun rights, gun control, abortion, healthcare, education, social services, all of the welfare, all of these different kinds of aspects that government addresses on a day-to-day basis, those make a difference on how the people in that particular area, especially the government in that area who are creating these policies, whether they side one side or the other, and therefore will favor legislation and policies that, illustrate one side rather than the other, or one part of the issue rather than the other. And so, like I said, it can change, whereas like a state like Kansas will, be really low, or not low, but conservative, on the conservative side of the house. Whereas, a state like California is always like #1 on the list for liberal scale. One doesn't mean best, it just means most liberal, whereas lowest number, 50, because 50 states, ends up being all side to the right. So, like I said, neither side is better or worse, but it's just showing you that's how a particular area or geolocation actually, you know, comes out in politics. So we measure these all the time in some state, and every couple of years or so, there's a little swing here and there where they go back and forth, change their attitudes on different things based on all sorts of specific national issues or state issues or local issues, stuff that causes people to think one way or another. And something huge like some big, you know, orchestrating moment in time can cause all sorts of opinions to change, and then slowly they'll kind of move their way back, or they stay at the new norm. Remember our punctuated equilibrium? Slowly everything was kind of going one way, and then something huge happened, and then they changed, and the norm is different than it was before. It's not better or worse, it's just different. So let's talk about a couple of the public policy areas that are important to understand, for at least for Texas. Regulatory policy. It's really hard to not talk about policies without talking about regulatory. So, the rules and the laws and the different codifications of what you do and can't do and all that. Well, I mean, there's a reason they're written down somewhere, so you don't have police going through and arbitrarily deciding you've committed a crime just because they don't like you. Unfortunately, that was a period of time in this country where that happened quite often. And so that's why we have constitutions, that's why we have rules, regulations, to make sure that sort of thing doesn't actually happen. So not only are the rules set up to, cause you to have to do things or not be able to do things, but sometimes those rules and regulations are designed to keep government from, forcing too much control over you. And so you have to think it's a give and take. And remember, those rules came from people who put people in power. And so we don't have a dictatorship or a monarchy, at least not yet, and I hope not. And so the thing is, these people who are put in power, we put them there, and they're there making these rules for us. And if we don't like what they're doing, we vote them out and we put somebody else in their place. That's how politics works, in order to get the people to make the policies. Kind of like that. Anyway, so let's talk about another one, which is healthcare policy. Healthcare policy was never really a huge government issue in the beginning. I mean, there were some movements, up until about the 1920s or so, in order to get, a lot of wives who were married to the legislators out there would often adopt all sorts of children policies and policies that were designed to, assist in medical care. And so it was always kind of seen as a woman issue, which it's not. And so what has happened is this has become more the mainstream, where people actually need health care, and it's important. It's a national thing. And so because of that, the issues themselves are getting legislated and decided through the policy process, because that's how you get things done. And they have to be done this way, because if you don't codify it, then again, people start doing things on their own, and there's no oversight and there's no accountability. So one of the other areas is primary and secondary education, which is always a bit of a problem, because there's always a desire to take money away from it, because it's a lot of money to educate people. But then when you do that, you end up with all sorts of other, side effects. And remember how I talked about before, where one thing can lead to another in different variable analysis, meaning if you don't, put money into your education, you end up with an uneducated population. Your uneducated population has a tendency to have to get money somehow, and if jobs require them to have degrees, the belief is they turn to a life of crime because they don't have anything else in order to do what they need to do. That doesn't always work out that way, but you get the idea. So I mean, there are positives to wanting education because a educated population is a good thing. It's also a thing that helps a country, thrive. The more education you have, the more business you end up getting, because I mean, education leads business to strong points. And that's what you want. And so there's no one or the other. They kind of go hand in hand. But again, sometimes it costs a lot of money to fund these programs. So what will end up happening is they'll take money away from it and kind of hope somebody else will replace the money. And quite often what's been happening is federal government has done less work to help education because they felt the states needed to do it. States then got involved and then realized, it was costing them a lot of money. So then they wanted the local jurisdictions to start taking place. And so this, cascading, rolling downhill thing, well, not good, because eventually you hit a point where there are no people left to pay the money. So then you go back to the original, and kind of what we did is we did a circle, and now we have the federal government stepping in and trying to replace, the money that's lacking for a lot of schools, because it kept cascading downhill until there was nothing left. And so we're kind of running into that, and eventually you have to hit, an equilibrium of that, to find out, how much should you put in as opposed to how much should you get out. And basically it should be on a cost benefit analysis, you should be getting something out of it, even if it's just education. But again, it's all what you consider to be profitable and what you consider to be the positive at the very end. So one of the other areas we tend to look at is social policies. There's all sorts of, what people should and should not be able to do based on all sorts of values. Could be anything from, local community standards to religious values to whatever things that happen that cause people to go, this is right or this is wrong. It could be same-sex marriage. It could be, like I said, there's all sorts of issues that become, political policies. And so those policies are social, and they affect people in all sorts of different ways. So somebody who doesn't have, an incentive one way or the other on one particular issue may not care that something's going on to somebody of a different issue. But if they don't pay attention to it, what happens is things start happening to them too, and then they start to find out those people who they didn't care about don't care about them, and you end up with basically nobody getting anything and nobody supporting anybody. And so that tends to be a problem. One of the other issues kind of going forward that we're seeing a lot of these days is immigration policy. Not necessarily a social policy, but it can have social ramifications. Immigration policy has been kind of difficult in this country because it often falls into politics rather than policy. And it's using policy to answer politics, which is usually never a good thing, but sometimes that's what happens. One of the other areas of, at least for Texas, that's really important, that's water policy. And the reason water policy is really important here is because if you run out of water, you really don't have any way of, helping your fellow citizens survive. Plus it also, you need them for farming and all sorts of things like that. And so there's all sorts of different rules and regulations based off of, like, is the water on your land above the land? Is it below the land? Is it something that you brought in yourself, and then therefore you're maintaining it from that point on? So all sorts of different rules, but it's policies that around all of these different aspects of it that kind of help you figure out, this is the way you should do it and this is the way you shouldn't do it. And as time goes forward, what'll happen is people realize this worked, this didn't work. And again, if something doesn't work, the idea is to either shelve it and get rid of it because it's not a good idea, or to look at it a different way and see if there's another approach to it that might make things better. So that's the gist of public policy in Texas. And I don't have much more to add than that. That was probably a little longer of a lecture than I wanted, but there you go.